Hey, welcome to Forest County and the Forest County Outback channel. Today we're going to look at logging camps, logging railroads, and steam-powered sawmills. Hey, we're at the Heart's Content Scenic Area, and this is one of the few remaining stands of old-growth forest left in the state of Pennsylvania. And when settlers began arriving in the late 1600s, over a large part of what became Pennsylvania, this was the predominant forest type, and mainly across the northern counties and down through the central mountains. Now, this was not good agricultural land. That's what the early pioneers were looking for, so most of them passed this area by. Now, the population here was small, and while they did engage in logging, it was limited because up until the mid to later 1800s, they were dependent on water transportation to move bulky items like timber and lumber downstream to the markets. Now, by the 1870s, railroads were working their way into this area, and this forest was still largely intact at that point. But, as I said, the railroads were coming in, and they were also developing specialized locomotives that would enable lumbermen to push tracks into basically every square inch of this area and set the stage for what is described as industrial scale timber extraction. And that really kicked off in the early 1880s and lasted into, say, the mid 1920s. By that time, the old growth forest had been, other than these few isolated tracks, had been completely decimated. It had been cut over and abandoned. The lumbermen, this was the era of cut and run, and after they cut here, they ran to western Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Appalachians out to the west coast, and started to repeat the cycle. Now, the forest has recovered, obviously, but not to what it once was, but it's, whatever. So anyhow, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum near Coudersport has recreated that logging boom era. They have a reconstructed logging camp. They have a Shea geared locomotive and a replica steam-powered sawmill. So a couple days ago, I packed up the entire production crew of Forest County Outback, myself, my son, daughter-in-law Rachel, and granddaughter Rowan, and we headed down here and we did some filming. And this is actually a two-parter. It got a little bit long. We had to break it up. But watch it, and this will give you a better sense of what life and work was like at that time period and what some of these sites we look at used to be. So this is Forest County Outback number 34, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, part 1. Okay, so this is a replica of a logging camp, and this would have been a mid-sized camp. And they have like some of the important buildings, your stable, the saw filer, and blacksmith shop, which you can see is working. and then the boarding house. Now, most of these buildings, they weren't well built because they were only used for a couple years, and this view is actually kind of misleading because this would have been a mud hole. Okay, there would have been grass growing here. You would have had, and it would have been kind of odoriferous because you would have had the smells from the stable. There would have been hogs running around, foraging on their own, and then of course all the unwashed bodies. Yeah, it would have been a little pungent here, and like I said, very muddy. Okay, we're in the engine house of the museum now. As soon as logging began to take place in Forest County, as soon as white settlers began moving in. Now, at that time, in the early 1800s, they were dependent on water transportation, so the areas they could log were limited. It wasn't until the late 1870s, early 1880s, when you began to see what has been described as industrial level timber extraction, and that was made possible by railroads. Now, when most people think of railroads, they're thinking like Petticoat Junction type things, but to do a logging railroad, you needed specialized equipment, and in the 1880s you began to see the development of the geared locomotive, and that's what this is. This is a 70-ton shay. It's bigger than most. This would have been used like on a main line, which required better track, better grading, and that. Most of the trains used in the Forest County area, the locomotives, were like anywhere from 10 to maybe 30-ton class. But when I say geared locomotives, let's go over here. This is what I'm talking about. Rather than a driver, you have what you had here. You had these steam cylinders over here, which drove a drive shaft, and that powered the wheels through these set of gears. And without getting into the physics of it, these things, they weren't very fast, but they had a whole lot of traction. They were pulling above their weight class as far as locomotives go. The other innovation was the pivoting truck, which you can see here. There's like a kingpin under there. Prior to this, the axles were built into a rigid frame, and that limited the radius of curve that the locomotive could handle. When you had the pivoting truck, they could do really, really sharp curves and eventually get into all kind of areas. Now you'll notice the boiler on this is offset. The shays were the only ones like that. The other major manufacturers were Heisler and Climax. And hopefully someday we'll get to look at examples of those. Okay. Only one side of the truck was powered. If you look on this side, there's no dry shaft on this side, but you can clearly see the brake system. And one of the things about logging railroads, usually the locomotive was the only unit that had air brakes. The log cars, we'll look at some of them later, they had the brakes had to be applied by a hand wheel. So this was a very complicated looking piece of machinery. So here is your throttle, air brakes, and your forward and reverse. Now the shade. Big firebox on that. It's huge. Now, the locomotive. Now, over here, we have a log loader. Logging cars were generally loaded by hand until these were developed, and these were also steam powered. I think this is a McGifford, I'm not sure. Barnhart. Okay. All right. This is a Barnhart log loader. There were a couple other ones, a McGifford and an American. I can get up and walk with the cab, but this is how you change. This is how it was rotated. And the Barnharts would travel from car to car. There would be rails on the car, and that's how it would move from car to car, loading each one or the next one as it went. No hydraulic clamps in those days. Now this must have been a miserable job in the summer because, you see, the operator was right next to the boiler, between the boiler and all the equipment, all opened, no guards. OSHA wasn't a thing then, and safety was not the main concern. Yeah, come up. Now, all the locomotive manufacturers also offered a line of log cars. I don't know who made this. A lot of operations did their own. They had homemade log cars. And there were a whole different variety of them. This had the rails on top, so the log loader could travel across it. The other log loaders that loaded off the track didn't need this. So they would just be like a skeleton car. So this is a stable where they kept the draft horses or oxen or whatever, and it's very basic. It's just a shelter and some hay and that. And the teamsters would, after dinner, would have to come out and take care of their teams, brush them down, make sure that there were no injuries in that. And there's a couple odds and ends up here. Like this sleigh is really interesting. Sometimes they use those for skidding in the winter, sleighs. This is a mock-up of the saw filer's shop in Cabin. He was one of the most important persons in the logging camp. He kept the saws and axes sharp, although a lot of cutters prefer to sharpen their own tools. But anyhow, this was generally the filer was a key man. And then next door is a blacksmith shop, and he was also one of the other key personnel. Okay, one of the other key personnel in the logging camp was the blacksmith, and Chris here is a reenactor, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what went on here and what the blacksmith did.
Right, yeah, so as you can see here, in a blacksmith shop, the blacksmith would have a forge. The blacksmith would have an anvil, and they would be pretty busy depending on the size of the camp, making axes. They did a lot, with axes and chains. If you think a little bit about the operation to get the wood, logs out of the forest into a central spot, horses would be pulling it. They might be doing horseshoeing, taking care of the horses. That, depending on the size of the camp, there might be somebody that just does that on their own. But a blacksmith would make chains and hooks and things to get them out of the forest, out of the woods. Also, if you think if they're building buildings, and at that time, blacksmiths would be making nails. They would doing the latches, hinges, and things like that. And there's some stories that maybe once the camp was done, because camps weren't there all the time, they would move once a job was done, and they might even burn some of the buildings down to get all the nails and hardware, so they wouldn't have to make them again at a new location. So depending on how big a camp it was, how many people were in there, you might have one or two blacksmiths. Sometimes a blacksmith could be working in tandem with two of them. Not just one person hammering on an anvil, but depending on the size of the steel and what they were making, they could be doing it in tandem too. So, or if the camp was small enough and there was a local blacksmith, maybe they would just use the local blacksmith instead of having their own shop. But we always say that a blacksmith isn't a good blacksmith until he can make his own tools, so they would be also making their own tongs and things like that. If you look around the shop here, you can see some things that have been made by a blacksmith for their projects and their everyday uses.
All right. So this is the head honcho's house. He was the jobber, the contractor, the foreman, whatever. And oftentimes they brought their family with them. But as you can see, very basic accommodations. But as I said, they were only here for a short time. this is the sleeping room, bunk room of the bunkhouse, and this area out here was the lobby. This is where they just kind of hung out and chilled, did whatever recreation they had available to them. And they would usually have a guy called the hobby log. He was generally an older guy who couldn't work in the woods anymore, and he was just kind of the housekeeper of the place. Now this is actually kind of misleading. There would have been a lot more bunks in here, but you can see they're really wide. You'd have had two, maybe three people to a bunk. Probably three of the size of these ones. But there would have been bunks down the middle, and again, you'd have had all these guys with their clothing that only got washed once a week, and their bodies that only got washed once a week. So, the other thing I forgot to mention is during the summer, the flies in these places would have been absolutely horrific. There was no such thing as privacy here. Yeah, and now that is a real candy bar. Not like those wimpy ones we get today. Okay, now there's a photo of what a bunkhouse would have looked like, although that's a log one, but similar, everybody crowded in there on top of each other, wet clothes hanging all over the place.
You know what they call tea?
Swamp water.
That's dry grass. Very cool. Thanks for giving us the rundown.
Come on back and you can place some soup down.
We've done a guess, which is what Jeff has.
All right, we're in the most important room of the bunkhouse, and that is the kitchen. And Jan is a reenactor, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what these guys ate.
Well, this area here is depicting anywhere from 1880 up to about 1920. The stoves would have been used the whole way through, your wood stove. This would not have been in a lumber camp, this stove here. This is a Victorian ladies' stove. They would have had one twice that size. There's a pan on the wall that they would have had 2 or 3 of those to cook on. The men would have had 3 meals a day. Beans would have been served at every meal in some form, because the men ate anywhere from 5,000 calories to 9,000 calories per day. They would have had 3 meals a day. You may not have had your lunch here. It depended on where they were in the woods. Lunch may have been taken out to them on a sleigh or a wagon. They would have had for breakfast your beans. You might have had some type of bacon and eggs. You could have had potatoes. They ate a lot of potatoes also in this area. Today for our lunch we're making ham bean riddle soup, because meat was mostly one time a day, or it was little pieces spread in every meal. So they ate a lot of stews. Your main meats would have been pork and chicken. You may have had a cow in the area, but that was mostly just for milk. They would have eaten a lot of deer that would have been brought in from different farmers that would have brought it into the camp to sell it. So then you would have had meat for a couple days using your deer. The lunch they would have had at dinner time would have been your main meal, and you would also had beans. But we're making today ham bean ribble soup. So I brought onions, carrots, celery. We got our ham. So first thing we need to do is saute our vegetables. The ham goes in next, and then the beans. And then we make the ribbles at the end, which is flour, egg. And it's like a little dumpling. And it also makes your gravy in your broth thicker. The men would have come in here to eat. They would have first been asked to wash their hands. All 40 men would have probably washed their hands in the same bucket. Cleanliness was not like it is today, that everyone washes their hands. Ivory soap was also period for that time, so you could always find your bar of soap. It would have been floating on the top and not down at the bottom of the bucket. Men were assigned a seat in the mess hall, and that was mostly because of if there was someone missing, were they left in the woods, or did they get upset and walk off. That way they knew if there was an empty spot, they had to replace that person. When they were in the mess hall, there was no talking between meals. The only time they talked was to pass me the salt and pepper. And they also had biscuits, or a form of biscuit mix, made into food every meal. So you could have shortbread, because it's made out of biscuit mix, pancakes, your biscuits. They would have used it for pie crusts. They had a lot of different baking items, all made out of the same product. Because there was another thing, it was cheap. Your flour mixture is cheap. Beans are cheap.
Okay. That's it for Forest County Outback 34, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, Part 1. We'd like to thank Chris and Jan for talking to us, and don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, share, and look for Part 2 soon. Thanks for watching. Oh, and don't forget you can follow us on Facebook at the Forest County Outback Facebook page. Thanks for watching.